What if I told you that stupidity isn't a lack of knowledge, but something far more deliberate? An elaborate psychological defense system your own mind constructs to protect you from truths you can't handle? What if the most intelligent people aren't the ones who know the most, but the ones who've developed the most sophisticated methods of self-deception? Picture this. A brilliant physician who understands virology suddenly denies basic scientific facts about disease transmission. A therapist trained in trauma begins dismissing their own patients' experiences. A philosopher who teaches critical thinking starts believing conspiracy theories that contradict everything they knows. These aren't ignorant people. They're educated, accomplished individuals who've fallen victim to what Sigmund Freud called the ego's capacity for intellectual self-sabotage. And here's what makes this truly terrifying. It's not happening to other people. It's happening inside your mind right now. This isn't just theoretical speculation. In the 1970s, psychologists studying motivated reasoning discovered something disturbing. When presented with identical evidence, people would accept or reject it based entirely on whether it threatened their existing beliefs. Brain scans later revealed that when people encounter information contradicting their worldview, the areas associated with physical pain light up. Your brain literally experiences threatening truths as damage. These weren't unintelligent subjects. They were normal people whose minds had automatically activated what Freud identified over a century ago, the unconscious capacity to choose stupidity over psychological pain. This is exactly what Freud observed throughout his clinical practice, and it led him to develop one of the most unsettling theories about human consciousness ever conceived. But before we dive deeper, I have to ask, have you ever refused to look at your bank statement because you knew it would be bad? That small act of deliberate ignorance? That's your ego choosing stupidity as protection. Keep that feeling in mind as we explore what might be one of the most important psychological mechanisms of human existence. Sigmund Freud wasn't a philosopher pondering abstract questions. He was a neurologist turned psychoanalyst who spent decades listening to the most intimate confessions of the human mind. Born in 1856 in what's now the Czech Republic, Freud initially pursued hard science, studying the nervous systems of eels and researching cocaine's medical applications. He had every reason to believe in human rationality and scientific progress. But as he began treating patients in Vienna, Freud witnessed something that shattered his faith in conscious reasoning. He watched as highly educated patients, lawyers, aristocrats, academics, would display what he called resistance. These weren't ignorant people struggling to understand. These were intelligent individuals whose minds were actively working to prevent understanding. The patient would approach the edge of a crucial insight, then suddenly change the subject. Another would forget appointments precisely when therapy was becoming effective. A third would intellectualize their trauma into abstract philosophy, using their intelligence as a shield against emotional truth. From his study in 1923, after being diagnosed with the oral cancer that would eventually kill him, Freud wrote what would become his most haunting observation about human consciousness. The ego is not master in its own house. Think about that. The part of you that believes it's in control and that thinks it's making rational decisions isn't actually running the show. What made this observation so chilling wasn't just its implications, but its mechanism. Evil actions, Freud noted, create guilt and internal conflict that eventually lead to confession or breakdown. But self-deception, the unconscious choice to remain stupid about threatening truths, creates no such conflict. It believes it's protecting you, making it absolutely immune to logical argument. Perhaps Freud's most prescient insight was about how stupidity serves the ego's fragile stability. Malicious people know they're doing wrong, which creates psychological tension. But people caught in defense mechanisms believe they're protecting themselves, making them absolutely resistant to contrary evidence. The unconscious doesn't need to actively suppress information. It just needs to create conditions where acknowledging truth becomes psychologically unbearable. When Freud used terms like resistance and repression, he wasn't talking about conscious lying or willful ignorance. He was describing something far more deliberate, what we might call structural self-deception or intellectual defense mechanisms. In his later works, he explained, the patient who exhibits resistance knows nothing of it. Even when it produces effects which he finds strange and surprising, he remains unaware of its existence. In this respect, his ego is not at all master of the situation. Here's what made Freud's theory so revolutionary. He argued that stupidity often emerges not from lack of education, but from psychological necessity. The mind protects itself from unbearable truths the same way the body protects itself from physical trauma, automatically or unconsciously, and often at great cost to long-term well-being. The truth is, our psychological systems actively incentivize intellectual blind spots. When acknowledging reality threatens your sense of identity, your relationship with loved ones, or your understanding of your life's meaning, the ego calculates that ignorance is cheaper than insight. Freud called this the psychic economy, the unconscious cost-benefit analysis your mind performs thousands of times daily. What psychologists now call motivated reasoning emerges. It becomes more efficient for the psyche to distort or ignore threatening information than to undergo the painful restructuring that truth would require. A parent denies obvious signs of their child's addiction. A spouse ignores clear evidence of infidelity. A nation refuses to confront its historical atrocities. But this individual psychological protection creates collective blindness, exactly the dynamic Freud observed in the mass delusions of his era. The result isn't just personal choice. It's structural pressure toward intellectual surrender. And our minds, desperate to avoid psychological pain, are perfectly designed to comply. While psychological systems push us toward defensive ignorance, our brains are actually wired to facilitate self-deception. Modern research on cognitive biases has confirmed exactly what Freud intuited over a century ago. When people encounter information that threatens their self-concept, the brain's threat detection systems activate before conscious reasoning even begins. But here's what Freud understood that modern psychology keeps rediscovering. This process is amplified when people are psychologically stressed or emotionally vulnerable. Exactly the conditions our current world creates. Freud observed that repression often operates through group dynamics. Writing about mass psychology in 1921, he noted how individuals would abandon their critical faculties when identifying with a collective. He noticed that perfectly rational people would accept obvious falsehoods when those falsehoods served to maintain group cohesion or protect collective identity. This insight was decades ahead of its time. Later research on groupthink and collective delusion demonstrated exactly what Freud had witnessed in pre-war Vienna. When surrounded by a group that collectively denies the truth, individuals will unconsciously suppress their own perceptions to maintain belonging. Now imagine how this plays out in our digital age. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that function like collective defense mechanisms. A 2021 study by Yale researchers found that people share misinformation not because they can't recognize it's false, but because sharing it serves psychological needs: belonging, identity protection, anxiety reduction. But here's the crucial insight. It's because false information often serves better as an ego defense than uncomfortable truths. When someone shares misinformation that protects their worldview, they're participating in what Freud would recognize as mass repression. The algorithm feeds them more of the same, creating digital echo chambers that act like collective neurosis. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed never shows you information that genuinely challenges your identity? That's not an accident. It's the architecture of mass self-deception perfectly designed to exploit Freudian defense mechanisms. We see this pattern play out repeatedly throughout history. The Victorian denial of sexuality wasn't conducted by evil people, but by proper families who genuinely believed they were protecting moral order. Freud himself documented dozens of cases where educated patients had developed elaborate intellectual systems to avoid confronting childhood trauma. In each case, intelligent people abandoned truth in favor of psychological comfort. If our psyches are wired for self-deception, how do we fight back? Freud believed that breaking free from unconscious stupidity requires what he called analysis, the painful work of making the unconscious conscious, the willingness to examine thoughts and feelings you'd rather ignore. But we're not just fighting our own defenses. We're fighting collective delusions and billion-dollar systems designed to exploit our need for psychological comfort. On an individual level, we can cultivate what Freud called analytic honesty, the capacity to observe our own minds without judgment but with rigorous truthfulness. This means noticing when we change the subject from uncomfortable topics, not to torture ourselves, but to understand what we're protecting. Here are some concrete practices that can serve as your daily resistance against psychological self-sabotage. First, start by observing your resistance. When you feel the urge to dismiss information or change the subject, pause. That feeling is your defense mechanism in action. Instead of fighting it, simply observe. Ask yourself, what am I protecting by avoiding this knowledge? Second, embrace productive discomfort. Freud observed that insight often brings anxiety before it offers relief. When you feel emotionally charged and certain about something, pause and ask yourself what feeling you might be avoiding by holding on to that certainty. If you can't identify any anxiety, that's a red flag. Third, slow down your reactions. Before posting anything online, take 60 seconds to ask yourself, why do I want this to be true? Instead of, is this true? That brief moment of self-reflection can break the cycle of defense mechanisms masquerading as opinions. Finally, practice saying, I don't know what to think about this yet, when something triggers strong emotions. In a world that rewards confident certainty over honest confusion, admitting psychological complexity becomes a radical act. But individual practices are insufficient. We also need collective spaces that make psychological honesty easier and more rewarding. This means creating cultures that value questions over answers, that reward people for changing their minds when presented with new evidence, and that see intellectual humility as strength rather than weakness. It means designing social platforms that don't exploit our defensive mechanisms for engagement. It means educational systems that teach emotional intelligence alongside critical thinking. Most importantly, we need social conditions that reduce the psychological threats that make people defensive in the first place. When people feel secure about their basic worth, identity, and future, they have more capacity to face uncomfortable truths. Freud's theory was brilliant for its time, but here's what he couldn't have fully foreseen. This isn't just about individual neurosis or Victorian repression. Modern technology has industrialized the exploitation of our unconscious defense mechanisms. Freud witnessed repression spreading through families and social circles. But we're living through something exponentially more dangerous. We've gone from individual defense mechanisms to algorithm systems that identify and amplify each person's specific psychological vulnerabilities. And now we're entering the age of AI that can generate perfectly tailored misinformation designed to bypass your specific rational defenses. The threat isn't just escalating. It's targeting the unconscious architecture of human psychology that Freud mapped over a century ago. This isn't just about therapy patients or Victorian neurosis. It's about the structure of your unconscious mind. Our psyches evolved to prioritize psychological survival over truth, to maintain coherent self-narratives over accurate ones, and to protect the ego even at the cost of wisdom. The scariest part is that we're all constantly running these defense mechanisms, no matter how self-aware we think we are. The mechanism is exactly what Freud described. When people feel psychologically threatened by information that challenges their identity or life meaning, they become more susceptible to any narrative that reduces this threat, regardless of its truth value. But here's the crucial insight that makes Freud's warning more urgent than ever. We're not just dealing with individual self-deception anymore. We're facing systems designed to exploit our unconscious defenses with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is being analyzed to determine which uncomfortable truths you're most motivated to avoid. We saw this play out in real time with climate change. Scientists, engineers, and educated professionals, people with demonstrated analytical abilities, began constructing elaborate intellectual systems to avoid acknowledging environmental catastrophe. These weren't failures of intelligence. They were successes of ego defense under existential threat. Freud paid a heavy price for his commitment to uncomfortable truths. Forced into exile by the Nazis in 1938 and dying of cancer in London in 1939, he never stopped insisting that human consciousness is built on layers of self-deception. His sacrifice wasn't just about surviving persecution. It was about defending the very possibility of self-knowledge against forces that profit from our unconscious ignorance. He understood that when people stop examining their own minds honestly, they stop being fully conscious. They become, in his words, puppets of the unconscious whose strings are pulled by whatever psychological need happens to be strongest. But here's what makes Freud's final challenge so relevant in the present day. The question isn't whether you have defense mechanisms, because everyone does. The question is, will you develop the courage to observe them? When facing a truth that threatens your identity, when maintaining ignorance feels psychologically necessary, when the cost of knowing seems higher than the comfort of denial, will you choose consciousness? The answer isn't found in superior intelligence or education. It's found in the daily practice of self-examination, the willingness to notice what you're avoiding, to sit with uncomfortable emotions, to question your most cherished certainties. These aren't heroic acts. They're ordinary practices that become extraordinary when everyone around you has stopped looking inward. The tragedy is that self-deception often feels like self-care. Avoiding painful truths is comfortable. It's easier to maintain familiar beliefs than to update them. It's psychologically cheaper to project our flaws onto others than to acknowledge them in ourselves. But Freud argued that this comfort is the cost of remaining unconscious. In a world that profits from our psychological defenses, choosing to examine our own minds becomes a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. We're all engaged in some form of self-deception right now. The moment we think we're completely self-aware, we've activated another defense mechanism, the illusion of insight. The price of consciousness is constant vigilance. Not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to choose comfortable stupidity over painful truth. Freud's theory of unconscious stupidity is unsettling precisely because it's so pervasive. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believing things that serve their emotional needs. Educated individuals constructing elaborate rationales for convenient conclusions. Well-meaning citizens supporting positions that protect their identity rather than solve problems. The problem isn't that people are getting less intelligent. It's that our systems increasingly reward emotional comfort over psychological honesty. But within this sobering diagnosis lies genuine hope. If stupidity is partly unconscious choice, consciousness can be cultivated. If it's partly defensive, environments can be made less threatening. If it's the result of mental overload, we can create conditions that make self-examination easier rather than harder. Think of self-examination like building psychological muscle. It's uncomfortable at first, but essential for health. Just as we wouldn't expect to navigate life without physical awareness, we can't expect to navigate complex realities without developing psychological insight. The mental discipline required for honest self-knowledge needs regular practice or it atrophies. The next time you catch yourself dismissing contradictory information without examination, the next time you feel the comfort of having all the answers, remember Freud's warning. Self-deception doesn't announce itself. It whispers that you already understand everything about yourself. And in that moment of recognition, you have a choice. Will you surrender to unconscious defense for comfort of certainty, or will you choose the more difficult path of self-examination? Freud's challenge isn't about whether we're smart enough to avoid self-deception, but whether we have the courage to keep examining our minds when it becomes painful, inconvenient, or threatens our self-image. In a world that profits from our unconscious defenses, choosing to develop self-knowledge becomes one of the most important things we can do. Here's my challenge to you this week. Take one belief you hold with strong emotional conviction and spend 30 minutes asking not whether it's true, but why you need it to be true. What would it mean about you if you were wrong? Not to torture yourself, not to become paralyzed by self-doubt, but to practice the kind of psychological honesty Freud spent his life defending. If your belief survives honest self-examination, you'll hold it more consciously. If it doesn't, you'll have learned something valuable about the difference between ego protection and truth. The future of human consciousness might just depend on how many of us collectively answer Freud's challenge. If this video has made you uncomfortable about something you were certain of, that's not weakness. It's the beginning of consciousness. Share this video with someone who isn't afraid to examine their own mind, even when it's painful. Because in a world designed to profit from our unconscious defenses, the simple act of self-examination becomes the most important form of resistance we have. And here's what I want you to remember. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, self-examination over self-justification, uncomfortable truth over convenient belief, you're not just developing your own consciousness. You're defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age of industrialized self-deception. What's one belief you're willing to examine this week? What psychological need might that belief be serving? Let me know in the comments. And let's commit to being the kind of people who remain conscious when everyone else has chosen comfortable stupidity.